The term AJAX recall is a coined term short for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. What it really refers to is in the JavaScript code of a page to make a GET or POST request, and then once the response comes back, using that data in the page. And this is very useful because it's the mechanism by which we can get new data from the server without actually having to navigate to a new page. Because normally in the browser, when you navigate to a new page, you see the whole current page disappear, it goes white, and then you see the new page fill in, often in fits and starts. And it all looks quite ugly and just doesn't really give us the interactive behavior that's most desirable. So how do we actually make an AJAX request? Well, in the global namespace of the browsers, you'll find a constructor function called XML HTTP request. And if we invoke this constructor with the new operator, we'll get back a new XML HTTP request object. We then take 3 steps to actually use this object. We assign a handler function to the property onReadyStateChange. We then invoke its open method, and then we invoke its send method. Looking first at the open method, it's taking 3 arguments, the first specifying that this is a GET request rather than a POST request, the second argument specifying the URL to which we're making the request, and then the third argument specifying that this is an asynchronous request rather than a synchronous request. The difference being that in a synchronous request, when you invoke the send method will not return until a response has been received, whereas in an asynchronous request, the send method will return immediately after making the request, and once the response actually comes back, that invokes the onReadyStateChange handler function. I'm not really sure why they give you the option of making synchronous requests, because to my knowledge it's a feature that no one ever really uses. In any case, looking back at the handler function here, you'll note it's called the onReadyStateChange rather than onReadyResponse or something like that, because in the course of making the request, you actually go through these 4 states of response readiness, denoted by request.readyState, which goes through state 1, 2, 3, and 4. Ready state 1 is triggered after the open method is invoked, ready state 2 after the send method is invoked, ready state 3 is invoked when the response starts coming back but hasn't finished loading, and then 4 is when the response has finally finished loading. So that's the one that's by far the most relevant. So here in our handler function, we're just testing, is the ready state equal to 4, and if so, then we know the response has come back and it's ready to be used. And then here we're checking the status of the response, that is the HTTP response status. And remember, 200 signifies an OK response, a good response. So if we get a code 200 OK response, we're going to just take the response data here, request.responseText, and we're just going to write it out to the console. And alternatively, if we get something other than a 200, we're going to treat that as an error. We're going to print out to the console error and request.statusText, which is effectively the error message that comes back with an HTTP response. Now, of course, in a real page, we do more useful things with the response data that comes back. We take it and say, insert it somewhere in the page so it's visible to the user, or something like that. Now, because as you can see, using XML HTTP request properly is a bit cumbersome, and also because there are some annoying little cross-browser difficulties you'd have to deal with when you use it, jQuery very thoughtfully provides more convenient mechanisms for making AJAX requests. There's jQuery.get for making an AJAX GET request, and jQuery.post for making AJAX POST requests. So for jQuery.get, you simply pass in 2 arguments, first the URL, and then the success response handler, the function which gets invoked upon a successful response. If you want to actually handle errors, responses that come back bad or fail to come back, that time out, there's another function you invoke to set those error handlers up before you invoke .get. But I'll leave that up to you to look up in the documentation. And then for post requests, it's the same deal, except we throw in another argument. We're throwing in the data which we're sending in the post request. And here we're expressing that as a JavaScript object, so it's sending height with a value of 4 and width with a value of 12. jQuery will take that object and parse it for you into a properly formed post body. Again, there are some complexities, some advanced options that I'm eliding over here. I'm just presenting the simplest use case. So I encourage you to take a look at the documentation. Now, when using AJAX requests, an important limitation to keep in mind is what's called the same origin policy, which is a policy browsers have implemented for security reasons that restrict your AJAX requests to the so-called same origin as the page itself. And origin here is defined as the scheme, whether HTTP or HTTPS or whatever, the domain name, and the port number. So say on the page retrieved from HTTP yahoo.com on the default port 80, well then the only AJAX requests that can be made from that page must also go to http yahoo.com on port 80. Now, as I said, this limitation was put in place out of security concerns because what a lot of malicious sites would try and do is to inject their code into someone else's page, trigger a request, an AJAX request from the page, and thereby send the data to their own server. In short, attackers could very easily steal users' data. Now, making AJAX requests to so-called different origins is something which legitimate websites would actually like to do. So, in fact, there are workarounds to this limitation. There's a technique called JSON-P, which stands for JSON with padding, and that one is a bit of a hack. It's making use of a browser feature in a way that it wasn't intended to be used. And there's another workaround called CORS, C-O-R-S, Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. This is a feature that was just recently added to browsers, so I believe the support for it, say in Internet Explorer, is still a little bit sketchy. If you're listening to this in late 2012 or later, it's probably a non-issue by that point. Without going into any detail, I'll mention that jQuery objects have a few methods for doing some basic animations, like say having an element fade out or fade back in, or slide up, down, left or right, or slide off the page, or a few other custom CSS animations you can do. Here, CSS animation meaning having an object transition from one CSS state slowly to some other CSS state. Like say over a period of time going gradually from a 12-point font to a 30-point font or something like that. And if you find that the effect you want to do isn't covered by these built-in methods of the jQuery object, well, jQuery has a facility for what it calls plugins, which are basically just additional libraries that make use of the underlying jQuery facilities, though a lot of these plugins will do things like add new methods to the jQuery object itself. You can find jQuery plugins from all sorts of sources. They're made by various third parties, though the jQuery site itself has a pretty comprehensive list of a lot of these plugins. Also on the jQuery site, you'll find what it calls jQuery UI, which is like an official plugin. It's an extension library that adds a whole number of widgets, things like date pickers or sliders or fancy checkboxes and that sort of thing. And these widgets are all highly customizable, so you can skin them to look how you want. Sometimes when you take a look at the source code for jQuery or for some other JavaScript library, you'll notice it looks like this garbage. It looks like a bunch of single letter variable names, no proper indentation or anything like that. It looks like a mess. What's going on here is that this code has been minified. Minify is a popular program which takes JavaScript code and tries to strip it down into the most compact form possible, serving the purpose of making JavaScript code significantly smaller and also obscuring it, making it harder for others to take your code and use it. In the case of jQuery, when you download it from the site, they give you the option to download the full source code or the minified version. The minified version is probably what you'll want to use for final production because you want to minimize the bandwidth usage. And the minified version of jQuery is about 30 kilobytes, whereas the unminified version, the original source, is about 300 kilobytes. So there's a big difference there. But in the course of developing your code, you may wish to use the unminified version so that in case you have a bug and you want to trace into the underlying jQuery code. Now, when it comes to debugging JavaScript code in the browser, a very essential tool in Firefox is an extension called Firebug, seen here, and that allows us to, say, put break marks on our JavaScript code. It can actually interrupt any running JavaScript code and show us the state of the page and the code. Now, Chrome actually has very similar facilities actually built in, so you don't need an extension for Chrome. You just go to any page and you hit F12 and you'll see a very similar tool which you can use to inspect the page and debug any of your JavaScript code, etc.